Throughout the last few years, you and I have spent rather a lot of time charting the history of the Mini. We've studied its initial conception and launch, its transformation into racer and cultural icon, how it was saved in the 1980s and then surfed towards Renaissance. But there are still a few gaps we can plug, so today on TwinCam we are met by the height of its powers, the shining light in the dark days of its maker, the Mini 1275 GT. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics, so if you can see yourself thrashing about the countryside in our little friend here, then please do follow the link in the description. But we alight our time machine in around 1967, 2 years before the launch of the GT, but 8 years into the life of the Mini in general. And as you might expect by that point, attention was beginning to shift towards a potential replacement. It's scarcely believable today, but despite its success and unparalleled image, the Mini never topped the British sales charts. That was the territory of its big brother, the 1100 and 1300, and without the heritage we now associate so closely with Alec Issigonis' miniature wonder, it was only natural for BMC, soon to become British Leyland, to look towards a Mini-less future. After all, in the car's early years, it was badged as an Austin 7 and Morris Mini Minor, attempting to live up to the memory of its own illustrious predecessors. But with 3 Monte Carlo rallies, countless touring car championships and 2 million examples under its belt, the rechristened Austin and Morris Mini was starting to show its age. The great man himself, the soon-to-be Sir Alec Issigonis, remained as BMC's chief engineer, so off he scampered in the search for betterment. His prototype supermini, known as 9X, included not only an all-new overhead camshaft engine, but also featured a hatchback rear end, previewing the then upcoming Austin Maxi. And in classic Issigonis fashion, it had more cabin space than the original Mini, while being over 4 inches shorter. 9X would have undoubtedly beaten the likes of the Fiat 127 and Renault 5 to market, but as I'm sure we all know, the Mini was barely, if at all, returning a profit. It's this economic climate of BMC failing financially and being unable to fund the development of new models that led to the Leyland merger in 1968. But long story short, the Mini would have to stick around. What was abundantly clear, however, is that it already needed some serious modernisation, our context being the reception received by the Mark II Mini in 1967. This was merely a facelift, consisting of a new, larger rear window, new square rear lamps, a squared-off grille, larger door handles, and that's about it. The press were not all that enamoured by the Mark II Mini, BMC flat out refusing to address any of the original car's problems, with features like external door hinges, frankly dangerous door catches, and the silly sliding windows steadily becoming a slap in the face of the consumer. Incidentally, Issigonis loved the sliding windows, the 9X retaining them because he was mad. It's clear to us then that Minis were imperfect, but consumers and reviewers alike still found them acceptable because no one had yet matched their inherent brilliance. Of course, we all love these things today for their cuteness, their agility and ability, their efficiency even, but not necessarily for their refinement. But back in 1967, that supermini market, defined by the Fiat 127, Renault 5 and later the Ford Fiesta, still didn't exist. Even the Fiat was still 4 years from market at this point, so BMC didn't see the need to reinvent the wheel. Instead, they needed to work with what they had, recognising its flaws and correcting them, leading us to both the Mark III Mini and the Mini Clubman. All the way back in 1959, the Mini appeared odd to the onlooking public. They eventually took it to their hearts, but by the end of the 1960s, the accepted appearance of a popular passenger car had changed considerably. This was the beginning of the wedge, the squared-off faces of the Mark II Ford Cortina and the Hillman Hunter proving the need of a facelift for the cutesy, bug-eyed Mini. In fact, Ford's family cars were beginning to run rings around BMCs, and as management realised their success was all about marketing and desirability, they decided to employ an actual proper stylist for their new range of cars. The man chosen was Roy Haynes, headhunted from Ford after working on not only the Mark II Cortina, but also the original Capri. His plan was to simplify the Austin Morris range and apply a new family appearance. The new Mini Clubman, Austin Maxi and Morris Marina all looked like a Mark II Cortina because that's what Roy Haynes liked. But back in the Clubman's development, some more serious alterations were planned for our little friend. It goes without saying that cleaner, safer internal door hinges, door handles designed for a car rather than a house, and truly decadent wind-up windows were the obvious production-bound changes. But some serious thought was also given to expanding the Mini's practicality with a hatchback of its own. Of course, this didn't reach production, presumably for the sake of cost, but it's proof of how serious this refresh was. The bottom line is that in 1969 we met the modernised Mini Clubman. Rather than replacing the Mini as a whole, however, the Clubman was really replacing the old Wolseley Hornet and Riley Elf, sitting at the top of the car's range, while the new Mini 850 and Mini 1000 took up the majority of the market. The Clubman was therefore posher than its round-nosed counterparts, completed by that more contemporary, if less aerodynamic, Haynes-styled front end. It still had no hatchback. It still had an A-series engine, and for the sake of further cost-cutting, gone before long was the brilliant hydroelastic suspension. It all smacks as a bit of a cheap tart-up of a possibly loss-making car by a company staring down oblivion. But there's a notable member of the Mini range we haven't yet mentioned, for though its sales were relatively low, its pedigree became entwined with the model itself, and its name, of course, was the Mini Cooper. The car that secured those race and rally successes was a hallowed member of the performance car scene, but in the context of BL's finances, it had a serious problem. The fact is that the Cooper was expensive to build and sell. For starters, the twin carburetors, the ridiculous cylinder head, a physically different block, and all the other modifications put a squeeze on the Mini's already tenuous profit margins. Then they had to pay John Cooper a £2 royalty for every car sold, and because they were so highly tuned, it was not at all unusual for a Mini Cooper to return to its dealer under warranty. Quite a few times as well. Management of the newly formed British Leyland wasn't only looking to save money on cars, but was also seeking out the dozens of advisors that BMC had hired from the aftermarket to improve their cars, among which were the likes of Daniel Richmond of Downton Engineering and a certain Mr. John Cooper. Whatever replaced the expensive and unreliable Mini Cooper therefore could not be called a Mini Cooper, and the result was our Mini 1275 GT. The Cooper is dead. Long live the Cooper. If you've seen my video on the Mini Cooper, then you'll be aware that it wasn't designed to be an everyman's performance car. It was not the kind of car that a Renault 5 Gordini, a Golf GTI or a Fiesta XR2 ended up being. Instead, it was an homologation special, a bit of a blank canvas marked out only by its contrast roof, designed to go fast rather than to look good. But as we rushed towards the 70s, the market for a hotted up, flashier saloon car began to spool up, and the GT is the perfect illustration of that. A mistake many people make when discussing this car is to believe that it was here to replace the full-fat Mini Cooper S. And as they share the same engine capacity, you'd be forgiven for thinking that. But instead what we have is the replacement for the old 998cc Mini Cooper. As the name suggests, a Mini Grand Tourer. And as such, it was the first Mini to gain any kind of exuberant and extroverted styling. And on that note, let's address that Roy Haynes facelift. This is something that continues to divide people 56 years since its debut. And while I'm on the side of it having ruined the Mini's inherent cuteness, I can't deny that it transforms it into a very smart, sophisticated small car. It's this perception that justifies, for me at least, its fitment to only the Clubman and GT, leaving the bottom of the range cars with the original Issigonis style. But the Square Nose's real benefit wasn't its appearance, but instead its access. With an extra 4 inches over a round nose, the A-Series ignition system and oil filter was suddenly far easier to service. In fact, in the fullness of time, the Clubman would become the favourite for those looking to fit larger, more modern engines, as the original's engine bay was knuckle-bashingly tight, but it does also bring forward some questions. 10 years earlier, being a pioneer of transverse engines, the Mini was lumbered with a side-mounted radiator. This was necessitated by the need for a belt-driven fan, and this makes a lot of sense. Indeed, the Mini's siblings had a similar system, but with a decade's worth of production behind them and now a heck of a lot more space, they still could not stretch to an electric radiator fan. We add that to our list of the rejected hatchback and the less aerodynamic shape, and it smacks even more of a company on an irreversible slide. The Mini therefore remained unnecessarily noisy, but at least British Leyland realised the value of aesthetics. You could fairly say that Roy Haynes was a bit of a one-trick pony. What with the Mark II Cortina, the Mini Clubman, the Austin Maxi and the Morris Marina all sharing their noses. And they say modern cars all look the same. But as I said earlier, it is very smart. This being a GT, however, we also have stripes flanking the sills and a red badge upon its tail. Early cars also had an obligatory GT badge on the grille, shared with its new big brother, the Austin & Morris 1300 GT. But this being a later car, it sadly lacks such a distinction. But by virtue of its relative modernity, this car is finished in the dreamy denim blue and has Dunlop's de novo wheels and tyres, making it both the first Mini to gain 12-inch wheels and one of the first cars in the world to be fitted with run-flat tyres. It's maybe a shame that it lacks the little 10-inch road styles of an early car, but it's still cool to see. Inside as well, we catch just a glimpse of the Mini growing up. Now sure, the old centre speedo is nicely symmetrical, but let's not forget that in period it was done because it was cheaper. Consumers and the press alike viewed it as a drawback, so in a shock to absolutely nobody, the Clubman and GT were the first Minis to receive instruments mounted in front of the driver, like on a proper car. And unlike the Coopers, the GT came fitted as standard with a rev counter. Naturally, none of this makes the car actually go any faster, and although it retains the displacement from the old Cooper S, it had to make do with only a single carburettor, a sleepier cylinder head and camshaft, and a block that was little more than a standard production unit. But that's not to say that the concept of a truly racy Mini was dead. Because through the 60s, the original run of Coopers was supported by BMC's competitions department, based at Abingdon, the home of MG. And the turn of events that led to both the 1275 GT and the creation of British Leyland did not kill off that department. Engineered specifically for the GT was a tuning kit, available from, fitted by and warranted by your local Austin or Morris dealer, which contained a new distributor, a smoother flowing cylinder head, and some very lovely twin carburettors. In fact, this particular car has a dealer accessory feature I'm sure a few of you will have already noticed. It's not one that will increase performance, but twin fuel tanks, in the greatest of Cooper-esque traditions, will certainly improve your Mini's endurance. With this additional context, therefore, we realise that for a period at least, the Cooper S didn't die. Instead, it was facelifted, titivated, and its performance supremacy was merely relegated to the options list. But of course, as we've discussed, the GT was really here to replace the standard 998cc Cooper, a car that, besides its potential reliability faults, was said to have produced 55 brake horsepower. We're met, however, by a bit of a conundrum, because I have two brochures for the Mini 1275 GT and they disagree on the car's power output. The earlier of the two, from 1972 if I recall correctly, says that this car produces 60 brake horsepower, which of course is a fair chunk more than the old Mini Cooper. But my later brochure from 1976, so more applicable to this car, says it makes only 54 brake horsepower. Regardless, that's still pretty much on the same page as the old Mini Cooper, but the trick of having this extra displacement, regardless of the carburation, is that you get a damn sight more torque. Depending on the brochure, that's either 67 or 69 pounds-feet, and it's produced at 2,500 revs. An old Mini Cooper, on the other hand, only makes 57 pounds-feet of torque, and that's all the way up at 3,000 revs. So you have more chugging ability with this car, more ability for this car to actually be operated in normal road conditions. And of course, this is a GT, a Grand Tourer, at least of sorts. And so the gearing is a damn sight higher than it was in the old Mini Cooper. If I can recall correctly again, I think the gearing of the original Mini Cooper was 3.765 to 1. That's the number that rings a bell anyway. But for the GT, that was lowered down, or at least a couple of years into production, it was lowered down to 3.44 to 1. And that means that the extra grunt from the larger displacement is only working to match the old Mini Cooper's acceleration. It's no quicker than a Mini Cooper. But it is a damn sight more refined. That's where the GT thing comes into it. And so while at 70 miles per hour, an old Mini Cooper will have been absolutely wailing at a piercing 4,700 and something RPM, this car can cruise at 70 miles per hour with the same 4-speed gearbox, essentially just a different final drive, at only a shade over 4,000. Certainly the A-Series engine was always known for its grunt, so to use that extra displacement in this way makes perfect sense when the character of the engine was never one of a screamer, really. But when this car was launched, it also used the same gear selection as the old Mini Cooper, the remote change that we have experienced and I absolutely adored. But from 1973, I believe, the launch of the Austin Allegro switched us to the rod change that this car has. So rather than having essentially a big engine steady below the car selecting the gears, we instead have a simple selector rod going into the back of the box. Speed bumps. And while there's certainly more feel to the selection, it's easier to tell where in the gate you are, I like the snicketiness of the old remote change just that little bit more. I think this is compromised in a way in order to suit the everyday motorist, which, to be fair, you can't knock them for. I'm also sure it was cheaper to produce. As for the ride and handling, well, it's a Mini, and Minis are absolutely spectacular, with one of the best turn-ins you would ever experience in a motor car. They are just spectacular, and actually I'm feeling the benefit of that longer gear ratio here, because we're cruising at just over 20 miles per hour here. I tried to go for fourth and it's just that little bit too tall a gear. In an old Mini Cooper, we'd be easily in fourth at this speed. But the ride and handling got worse during the 1275 GT's production. Reason being that in the 60s, the Mini switched to using Alex Moulton's phenomenal, incredible, terminally underrated hydroelastic suspension. Hydroelastic in the most basic form works by having a rubber cone doing your springing, as you just pull onto this dual carriageway. Having a rubber cone doing your springing and then fluid damping that's interlinked throughout the car. But from 1971 or so, when the Mark III Cooper S was discontinued, the Mini Clubman and the 1275 GT, the only two cars that kept using the hydroelastic, the 850 and 1000 have switched back to the cones for cost, also switched back to the cones, which I think is a crying shame, but it doesn't take anything away from the Mini, realistically, because the Mini is not about comfort. So if you're buying one for comfort, then you're not really doing the right thing. But regardless, hydroelastic Minis are that much more comfortable and don't take all that much away from its driving ability. So I would have a hydroelastic one, like an early 1275 GT, but there's nothing wrong really with the cones on this later car. The bottom line, of course, is that it's a Mini, and that makes me feel really exceptionally happy. With that in mind, we realise exactly what the GT was. A cheaper to buy and run, more reliable, more modern and undoubtedly flashier hot Mini. And for the average consumer, rather than amateur racer, what was not to love? Indeed, the reordering and refreshing of the Mini's range coincided with its most successful era. 1971, the first full year where these cars were truly on stream, saw Mini production peak at nearly 318,000 cars. Yet tellingly, 71 was also the final year where the Mini lay unmatched. With the debut of the aforementioned superminis, its star began to fade, and by the time of this particular example, reviews of all models were turning sour as their refinement and practicality just could not compete with the likes of a Fiat 127, Renault 5 or Ford Fiesta, all of which were just a more sensible choice. Of those 318,000 Minis sold in 1971, sales by 1977 were down by more than half. Naturally, the ills of British Leyland, what with their bankruptcy and nationalisation, are partly responsible for this. But nobody could deny that the Mini was yesterday's car. But with our little friend's eventual replacement, the Austin Metro, still a few years away, BL needed to recapture some of the magic that popularised the Mini back in the 1960s, employing a certain Richard Longman to prepare and race a 1275 GT in the British Saloon Car Championship. In 1978, the Longman prepared Minis utterly trounced the competition, not only winning the championship, but taking 11 class wins out of 12 races. And in the following year, the little Leyland Minis took wins in every single event. From a quality or practicality perspective, there may well have been better choices than our old friend. But with another pair of giant killings, the Mini's 4th and 5th British Touring Car Championships, its performance was never to be doubted. These back-to-back successes were the Mini's last before the Metro took over, and while these victories might not have made a noticeable difference to the Mini's sales, they reignited the fire that had arguably been extinguished by British Leyland's woes, cementing the Mini as still, in 2025, the most successful model ever raced in the British touring cars. With the Metro's introduction, however, both Clubman and GT were not long for this world. In the summer of 1980, the Mini range was rejigged, moving the focus towards economy and the old round-nosed body shell, all cars now being fitted with the smaller 1-litre A-Series engine. But taking the GT's life in totality and its rationalisation, clearer marketing and profit-focused approach makes all of the sense. Yet in the 10-year life of the original Mini Cooper, 125,000 cars were produced. In the just over 10-year life of the GT, however, only 110,000 rolled out of Longbridge. Now, the rise of the hot hatch throughout the 1970s will have undoubtedly made the GT's market more difficult than the Coopers. But if the mission statement of the Mini 1275 GT was to make money by jazzing up the car and using more reliable components, endearing it to more economy-minded and younger buyers, then you can't justify that shortfall. The raw numbers can be mitigated, sure, but we can't see this car as anything other, I'm afraid, than a failure. And if we compare those 110,000 Mini GTs to the 142,000 MG Metros produced across only 8 years, between 1982 and 1990, then it looks even worse. Again, there are mitigating factors at work, but the simple fact is that alongside British Leyland's 1970s slide, their small sporting cars took a slide as well. The concept of a hot Mini would remain fairly in the aftermarket until the Cooper famously returned in 1990. But when Rover Special Products went to that effort, what we were left with was a 1275cc A-Series engine with a single SU carburettor and just over 60 brake horsepower. If the parallels weren't already clear enough, then that engine was a detuned version of the 72 brake horsepower unit found in the MG Metro. Some things really do never change, but that leaves me without a valuable conclusion. Because sure, this car was a poor relation compared to the old Cooper S, but it was more refined and more reliable than the old standard Cooper. And as a result, I see it therefore as not my favourite Mini, but one that brought a whole new focus from the small car market upon the Mini, one that was necessary in British Leyland's decade of plight. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.